below moving desert grains, inside the leaves of antique manuscripts, and within the footings of structures remaining firm millennia afterward, we discover proof of astonishing technical achievement that contests our comprehension of history. We discover self-mending cement that strengthens across centuries. A vanished violet rock so solid it demands diamond-tipped instruments to slice, and blades crafted with a purity unattainable for 1,000 years. Even a fluid flame employed for maritime combat that annihilated whole forces before disappearing, never to be reproduced. These tangible remnants symbolize pinnacles of engineering that equal the benchmarks of our own era. In this presentation, we investigate 15 of these exceptional technical pinnacles that were attained, perfected, and then left unmatched for ages. Numerous of these specialized techniques vanished together with the societies that sustained them, abandoning solely the material artifacts for us to scrutinize. Therefore, if that appears engaging, then lean back, unwind, procure a treat, and accompany us on this profound exploration into the ancient world. And if you appreciate documentary-style investigations such as this each week, ensure to subscribe. Now, let us commence. This degree of slope regulation enabled them to convey water from sources situated over 5 miles distant, furnishing a steady provision to the city's core through mere gravitational force. Managing water constituted the principal method the Nabateans safeguarded their prosperity. They were positioned at the intersection of the most profitable commerce pathways in the ancient world, specifically those for frankincense and myrrh. Caravan commanders journeying from southern Arabia to the Mediterranean were compelled to traverse the Nabatean domain. By supplying dependable water and security within a landscape where both were absent, the Nabateans established a strategic monopoly. They imposed substantial levies for transit and water privileges, transforming a nomadic clan into one of the most affluent kingdoms in the area. Contemporary technological progress has disclosed the authentic magnitude of this engineering. Examinations performed by researchers such as T.S. Asher and the Petra National Trust have charted the surface remnants, yet LIDAR scans have furnished a view beneath the sand. These aerial surveys employing laser illumination revealed thousands of concealed conduits, diversion barriers, and terrace arrangements that the unaided eye cannot perceive. These constructions served a dual function. Throughout the arid season, they directed moisture into reservoirs. During the infrequent yet severe winter tempests, they operated as an inundation management network. By disrupting the force of sudden floods via a sequence of minor dams, the Nabateans shielded their city from being swept away, while concurrently seizing the floodwater for subsequent utilization. The decline of this aquatic dominion commenced with the Roman annexation in 106 AD. While the Romans were also exceptional engineers, their advent altered the region's priorities. The specialized workforce that the Nabateans had utilized for centuries to cleanse the terracotta conduits and sustain the silt traps was redirected to other imperial endeavors.
The scanner is
Over time, these networks started to malfunction. Without perpetual sediment removal, the subterranean channels obstructed. A sequence of significant seismic events during the 4th and 6th centuries AD ultimately fractured the reservoirs and ruptured the primary aqueducts. Lacking the technical understanding or the assets to mend the concealed infrastructure, the populace diminished and the desert ultimately reclaimed the city. During the 20th century, archaeologists and engineers started to recognize that the ruins of Petra exceeded merely a cemetery of sanctuaries. Modern desert engineers now examine the Nabatean techniques to devise sustainable water-gathering systems in arid zones. The Nabatean methodology of modest, scaled decentralized water accumulation is frequently more effective in desert environments than contemporary large-scale dams which forfeit enormous quantities of water to evaporation. While we comprehend the physics underlying their pipes and gradients, the sheer extent of their underground network stays an unequaled accomplishment in water preservation. The shift from the Nabateans' mastery of fluid water to the Roman mastery of solid architecture demonstrates how engineering secrets could delineate an entire epoch. While the Nabateans were concealing their water below ground, the Romans were employing a distinct type of chemical secret to erect monuments that would endure in the open atmosphere for millennia. This directs us to the enigma of the Lycurgus cup, a glass fragment that manipulated illumination in a manner that would not be observed again for over 1,000 years. To the casual observer within a museum, it appears as a skillfully fashioned ornamental object. Yet, when the lighting alters, it exhibits a physical characteristic that would not be witnessed again in the human chronicle for over a millennium. The chalice was fabricated during the midpoint of the 4th century AD, a period of considerable cultural and religious transition within the Roman Empire. This was the epoch of the Constantinian dynasty, a time when the imperial court preferred elaborate cage, cup-style receptacles known as diatrida. These were the most costly and technically challenging glass artifacts of the Roman world. Presenting an outer decorative lattice that was meticulously carved away from a singular solid block of glass, the Lycurgus cup is the sole intact specimen of such a vessel crafted from dichroic glass, designating it as a unique masterpiece likely commissioned for the uppermost echelons of Roman society. The imagery engraved into the glass is as intense as the science behind it. It portrays the mythical monarch Lycurgus of the Edoni in Thrace, who was being strangled by vines as retribution for his arrogance. According to the legend, Lycurgus had assaulted the god Dionysus and one of his maenads, Ambrosia. In retaliation, the deities transformed Ambrosia into a grapevine that coiled around the king, entrapping him. The selection of this specific tableau was profoundly deliberate, because the chalice was employed for consuming wine. The transformation of the glass from green to a profound wine-red hue functioned as a visual metaphor for the potency of Dionysus and the very fluid the vessel was engineered to contain. The most remarkable attribute of the chalice persists in its optical conduct. When the cup is illuminated from the front, it manifests as a solid opaque pea green. If a light source is positioned inside the chalice or behind it, the glass undergoes an abrupt alteration, turning a deep translucent blood red. This outcome was attained through a procedure that perplexed historians for decades. The most intricate portion of this science encompasses the principles of refraction and diffraction. When a consistent ocean swell meets an island, the terrestrial mass functions as a physical obstruction. The wave cannot simply traverse through and must instead curve around the island's peripheries. This curving is termed diffraction. As the waves envelop around the land, they converge upon the sheltered side, generating a distinctive interference configuration. A navigator who identifies this particular cadence within the water understands that land is proximate even if it remains below the horizon. Additionally, as a swell nears the shallow water adjacent to a reef or coastline, it decelerates and alters direction, a procedure recognized as refraction. This induces the waves to arc toward the land. A secondary outcome is the reflection of waves. A swell striking a vertical precipice or a steep reef will rebound toward the expansive sea. This creates an abrupt tremor within the water's movement that is separate from the regular pulse of the ocean. By charting these reflected and refracted configurations, Polynesian mariners could sense the existence of an island from beyond 50 miles distant. The custodians of this understanding were the Palu, or master navigators, chiefly from the Caroline and Marshall Islands. Their instruction commenced during early youth and involved committing to memory the ascending and descending positions of hundreds of stars. This cognitive framework is frequently designated a star compass, where the horizon is segmented into various houses grounded upon stellar placements. However, the genuine trial of a palu was their capability to navigate when the stars were obscured. To instruct these abstract configurations of fluid dynamics, the Marshalese devised stick charts. There existed three principal varieties of these charts. The matang was a minor symmetrical lattice employed for teaching the universal tenets of how waves curve around an island. The Rebeli was a more extensive map that displayed the wave configurations across an extensive region of an entire island chain, utilizing minor cowrie shells to symbolize particular atolls. The Emeto was a localized chart concentrating upon the particular currents and swells encircling a few neighboring islands. These were not transported on voyages and instead functioned as educational implements utilized on land to embed the configurations into the navigator's recollection. The social framework of the Marshall and Caroline Islands sustained these decades of instruction because extensive distance travel was vital for survival. These islands are often low-lying atolls susceptible to droughts and typhoons. By sustaining commerce networks via wave navigation, these communities guaranteed they could convey sustenance and assets between islands during periods of calamity. The navigation operated as the logistical foundation of a vast oceanic civilization. During the mid-20th century, Western academics frequently contended that it was improbable for individuals devoid of instruments to have sailed so accurately. They proposed that the Pacific was inhabited by accidental seafarers who were driven off route by storms. This viewpoint transformed in 1976 with the inaugural voyage of the Wakalika, a reproduction of an ancient Hawaiian double-hull voyaging canoe. The undertaking aimed to sail from Hawaii to Tahiti, employing solely traditional methods to demonstrate that the migration was a deliberate accomplishment of engineering and aptitude. The 1976 voyage was directed by David Lewis, an investigator of traditional navigation, and Maupialug, a master navigator from the island of Satawal. Mao was one of the few residual individuals who had undergone the complete traditional Pu initiation, a ceremony that denotes the conclusion of a navigator's training. Throughout the 2,500-mile journey, Mao did not employ a compass, a timepiece, or any written logs. He preserved the canoe's location by observing the angle of the swells against the hull and monitoring the stars during the limited hours they were visible. When they reached Tahiti, precisely on target. The voyage illustrated that wayfinding was an exact and replicable science. The triumph of the voyage ignited a cultural revival across the Pacific, yet it also emphasized how much of the original technology had been forfeited. The advent of Western explorers during the 18th and 19th centuries introduced the sextant, the chronometer, and paper charts. While these implements were effective, they rendered the traditional sensory-based instruction seem superfluous to younger generations. The rigorous procedure of learning to interpret the water started to diminish as colonial influences and modern technology redefined island existence. Much of the particular local comprehension regarding swell configurations around certain island clusters vanished with the passing of the elder Palu. For instance, Maupialug observed that he was one of the final in his lineage to comprehend certain deep water swells that were only detectable during particular lunar cycles. While modern organizations like the Polynesian Voyaging Society have effectively revived the universal tenets of wayfinding, some of the most nuanced sensory proficiencies, such as detecting land through the particular vibration of the vessel's keel, are considerably more challenging to recuperate. Presently, wayfinding is practiced as a method to connect with heritage and illustrate the sophistication of ancient Polynesian culture. It remains a testament to an era when humans could interpret the environment with a degree of detail that we now assign to computers. The capability to traverse 5 million square miles of ocean employing solely the rhythm of the waves is a zenith of human observational proficiency. And while the Polynesians were interpreting the surface of the ocean to locate land, the Nabateans were engineering the subsurface of the desert to establish a functional aquatic empire. Within the southern desert of contemporary Jordan resides the city of Petra, an expansive metropolis carved directly into crimson sandstone cliffs. Today, the location is renowned for its ornate facades, yet its existence was solely plausible because of an immense, unseen infrastructure that managed an exceedingly scarce resource. The Nabateans were originally a nomadic Arab populace who settled within the region around the 4th century before the Common Era. They selected a location that appears strategically flawed for a permanent city, as the area receives less than 6 inches of yearly precipitation. Despite this, Petra expanded to accommodate an estimated 30,000 individuals at its zenith. The city did not merely endure. It showcased verdant public gardens, massive open-air pools, and fountains that operated year-round. This was attained through a sophisticated comprehension of hydrology and gradient administration that permitted them to harvest each droplet of moisture from an immense surrounding drainage basin. The nucleus of their technology was a network exceeding 800 concealed subterranean cisterns. These were not elementary cavities in the ground, but engineered chambers carved into the solid bedrock. To prevent the stored water from permeating into the porous sandstone or evaporating within the intense warmth, the Nabateans formulated a specialized waterproof plaster. Chemical analysis demonstrates this plaster was founded upon a mixture of lime and volcanic ash, which generated a durable hydraulic seal that actually solidified when exposed to water. By maintaining the reservoir subterranean and firmly sealed, they ensured the water stayed cool and devoid of the bacteria that typically prosper in exposed desert pools. The logistics of conveying this water into the city's core demanded an elevated level of mathematical exactitude. The Nabateans positioned miles of terracotta pipes along the cliff faces, preserving a consistent descending gradient of precisely 4 degrees. This particular slope was a calculated selection. If the angle was excessively precipitous, the water pressure would escalate to a point where it would rupture the ceramic junctions. If the angle was excessively gradual, the water would stagnate or fail to attain its destination. Envision a battleground 2 millennia ago where a solitary blade could determine the destiny of an empire. Across the ancient world, narratives circulated of a metal so keen it could sever a descending silk veil and so durable it could fracture a standard iron broadsword without incurring a dent. These armaments were not merely implements of warfare. They were regarded as nearly supernatural artifacts treasured by Roman emperors and pursued by the elevated courts of Han China. This fabled substance was Wootz steel. It symbolizes a pinnacle of antique material science that stays one of history's most bewildering technical anomalies. For over a millennium, the secret to its fabrication was the most precious industrial secret on the globe. Concealed within the remote villages of the Indian subcontinent, the enigma of Wootz steel commences with its performance. During an epoch when most soldiers bore heavy, brittle iron blades that frequently warped or shattered in the heat of combat, the warriors of the Indian subcontinent possessed something entirely distinct. The Wootz blade presented an ideal union of opposites. It was sufficiently rigid to retain a razor edge, yet pliable enough to absorb the impact of a cavalry assault. When burnished, the surface of the metal disclosed a distinctive swirling design that resembled flowing water or shifting sand. This aqueous pattern was not a decorative engraving or a superficial treatment. It was the physical manifestation of the steel's internal crystalline architecture extending completely through the core of the blade. To comprehend who created this magnum opus, we must journey back to at minimum the 6th century before the Common Era within the southern territories of India. The master smiths of the Chera, Chola, and Pandya dynasties cultivated a localized industrial complex that was centuries ahead of its time. These artisans were not simply blacksmiths. They were effectively the world's initial chemical engineers. They functioned within the Deccan Plateau and the regions of Tamil Nadu, converting the rugged landscape into a massive manufacturing center. This was a state-sponsored industry that fueled a global trade network, with the steel serving as the principal high-value export that conveyed Roman gold and Mediterranean wine into Indian harbors. The production procedure for a singular Wootz ingot was an exercise in extreme patience and atmospheric regulation. The smiths utilized a crucible technique that was fundamentally distinct from anything witnessed in Europe during that period. They would procure high-purity iron ore and enclose it inside small hand-molded clay crucibles alongside specific organic materials incorporating wood and the foliage of the Acacia auriculata plant. Once sealed airtight with clay, these vessels were positioned into a furnace and heated for numerous days. By sealing the crucible, the smiths generated a pressurized oxygen-free environment. This permitted the iron to gradually absorb carbon from the charred plant matter, transforming the raw ore into a high-carbon alloy with a precision that contemporary sensors find challenging to match. The function of the organic matter within these crucibles was recently illuminated by modern science, and the outcomes were startling for investigators. During the late 1990s, investigations by metallurgists like John Verhoeven and Alfred Pendre employed electron microscopy to gaze into the heart of antique Wootz specimens. They discovered that these antique smiths were inadvertently practicing nanotechnology. The particular leaves and wood employed in the process acted as chemical catalysts, generating carbon nanotubes and cementite nanowires within the steel. These microscopic structures bestowed the metal with its legendary resilience. The South Indian smiths had discovered a method to manipulate the molecular architecture of steel over 2,000 years before we even understood what a molecule was. The rationale this steel was so significant reduces to the specialized military necessities of the era. The South Indian empires were naval and terrestrial superpowers that required weaponry capable of withstanding prolonged high-intensity warfare. They devised weapons like the Urumi, a flexible whip sword that demanded the steel to be coiled and snapped repeatedly. Solely Wootz steel, with its nanostructure of hard carbides within a softer, flexible matrix, could survive that variety of mechanical stress. It furnished their elite regiments an advantage that was both psychological and physical, as their blades could effectively outlast the armaments of their adversaries in a war of attrition. The global demand for this material ultimately led to one of the most renowned scientific failures in history. During the early 1800s, the British physicist Michael Faraday became fixated upon the rust-resistant and shattering qualities of Indian steel. He was provided original samples and attempted to replicate the process within his laboratory. Faraday was the individual who pioneered our comprehension of electromagnetism, yet he could not decipher the code of the Wootz crucible. He suspected the secret resided in adding silica or aluminum. Yet his reproductions lacked the characteristic aqueous pattern and the internal fortitude of the originals. He eventually abandoned the project, leaving the steel as an unresolved enigma upon his workbench. Verhoeven and Pendre ultimately discovered why Faraday and so many others had failed. The secret was not merely in the carbon or the heat. It was in the earth itself. The iron ore located within Deccan Plateau contained natural trace quantities of vanadium. This rare element functioned as the essential seed that permitted the cementite nanowires to develop in parallel bands. Without that specific geological fingerprint, the traditional formulas were ineffective. The antique smiths had cultivated a technology that was perfectly calibrated to the chemistry of their local soil. When those particular ore deposits started to deplete during the 19th century, the aqueous pattern ceased appearing and the secret started to slip away. The final blow to the technology was political. As the British East India Company solidified its grip upon India, they recognized that local wood's production constituted a threat to the industrial steel being imported from Britain. To safeguard their economic interests, they imposed a prohibition upon local smelting and forcibly dismantled the manufacturing networks within the South. Because the process was an oral tradition transmitted through generations of master-apprentice lineages, the loss of active production signified the death of the knowledge. The men who could interpret the color of the fire and the sound of the cooling crucible perished without conveying their instinct for the metal. In the modern era, we can generate contemporary alloys that are incredibly strong, yet we still grapple to replicate the exact internal nanostructures of antique woods, utilizing the identical raw traditional methods. We possess the data to inform us what resides inside the metal. Yet we have forfeited the intuitive mastery of the elements that permitted a village smith 2,000 years ago to forge a piece of nanotechnology. And thus the shimmering aqueous pattern upon a wood's blade is the physical record of a peak of human genius that we are still endeavoring to comprehend, while the metallurgists of the Indian subcontinent were refining the chemistry of high-carbon steel. Another group of explorers was cultivating a complex system of trans-oceanic travel upon the opposite side of the planet. These were the early Polynesians. Without the application of metal tools or magnetic instruments, these voyagers inhabited the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean, an area encompassing nearly 1/3 of the Earth's surface. This migration was a deliberate and systematic expansion that witnessed people traverse thousands of miles of open water to locate and colonize isolated land masses like Hawaii, New Zealand, and Easter Island. The settlement of the Pacific commenced over 3,000 years ago with the Lapita culture, a group of individuals who migrated from Southeast Asia through the Bismarck Archipelago. Archaeological evidence such as distinctive stamped pottery discovered across various islands demonstrates a clear trajectory of movement. These early mariners journeyed contrary to the prevailing trade winds, a tactic that permitted them to reverse course and sail back home swiftly if they failed to locate land. This methodical approach underscores that the discovery of these islands was the consequence of coordinated exploration rather than accidental drifting. The primary challenge of this voyage was the sheer magnitude of the Pacific. Once a canoe departs the site of land within the Solomon Islands or Fiji, there exist no landmarks for thousands of miles. The sun and stars furnish some direction, yet the climate within the tropics is frequently overcast, occasionally for weeks consecutively. To maintain a direct course through the windless and cloudy regions near the equator, navigators cultivated a specialized comprehension of the ocean's surface. They concentrated upon the behavior of deep sea swells, which are the lengthy low waves generated by distant storms. Within the field of wave navigation, a master sailor identifies primary swells that travel across an entire ocean basin without altering direction. Even when the local wind shifts or a tempest generates surface waves, the deep primary swell remains constant. A navigator seated within the hull of a double-hull canoe can sense the particular pitch and roll provoked by these swells. They utilize the motion of the vessel as a physical reference point to preserve a consistent heading. This technique demands an extreme degree of sensory sensitivity, as the sailor must isolate the rhythm of a swell that might be merely a few inches elevated from the more prominent noise of the surface waves. Whenever the weight proved ample, a catch would disengage, permitting the wheel to revolve precisely one increment, 1/36th of a complete revolution, before being seized by an alternate catch. This intermittent movement was then conveyed through an intricate arrangement of bronze cogwheels and the planet's first documented continuous power, transmitting linkage. At the absolute summit of the edifice, this power rotated an enormous bronze armillary sphere, which constituted a simulation of the celestial bodies that revolved to correspond with the live motions of the stars. The objective of such an immense endeavor was profoundly connected to the mandate of heaven. Within imperial China, the sovereign was regarded as the connection between the heavenly and terrestrial domains. If the imperial calendars proved erroneous, or if an eclipse remained unpredicted accurately, it was construed as an indication of divine disapproval. Consequently, the advancement of the cosmic engine constituted a matter of state protection and political validity. Susong, a skilled astronomer and diplomat, was commissioned with fabricating a device capable of monitoring the heavens with such exactitude that the emperor's supremacy stayed unchallenged. The tower additionally showcased an automated exhibition where wooden figurines would emerge from doorways at predetermined intervals to strike gongs or display plaques signifying the hour. The individual behind the creation, Susong, was a genuine polymath who perceived engineering through a perspective of integrated systems. He did not solely devise the timepiece. He orchestrated an extensive assembly of metalworkers, woodworkers, and arithmeticians to actualize his conception. His background as a diplomat implied he had journeyed extensively, and it is probable he amalgamated diverse regional technologies into this singular unified apparatus. He was also a recognized botanist and mineralogist, which granted him a comprehension of the substances necessary to prevent the bronze cogwheels from corroding or jamming under the perpetual dampness of the water-propelled mechanism. The examination of this technology was introduced to the awareness of the contemporary West by the historian Joseph Needham. Within his monumental publication, Science and Civilization in China, Needham chronicled what he termed the Great Interruption. He inquired why a civilization that had mastered the mechanical escapement, the linkage drive, and the magnetic compass so prematurely ultimately observed these technologies stagnate or disappear before the modern age. Needham's investigation underscored that Susong's chronometer was not merely an ornament. It was a zenith of industrial design that preceded the European Renaissance by several centuries. Further pragmatic inquiry into the tower has been executed by the National Museum of Natural Science in Taiwan. During the late 20th century, a team of engineers and historians endeavored to construct a full-scale operational reproduction of the cosmic engine founded upon Susong's original schematics. They discovered that the intricacy of the original water-propelled escapement was so elevated that it demanded constant, highly proficient manual calibration to preserve accuracy. Without the assistance of contemporary electrical pumps or sensors, the equilibrium of the water levels and the strain within the linkage drive demonstrated to be a delicate performance of mechanical upkeep that necessitated a devoted workforce of specialists. The forfeiture of this technology was abrupt and brutal. In 1127 AD, the Jin invaders from the north seized the capital city of Kaifeng. This occurrence, recognized as the Jinkang Incident, effectively terminated the northern Song dynasty. The invaders were captivated by the cosmic engine and attempted to dismantle the tower and convey it to their own capital in the north. However, when they arrived, They discovered they could not reassemble the elaborate arrangement of levers and cogwheels. The specialized engineers who comprehended the celestial equilibrium had either been slain or declined to cooperate. The tower was ultimately abandoned to oxidize, and its components were presumably melted for bronze. Throughout the chaotic withdrawal of the Song Court to the south, the original blueprints and Su Song's technical annotations were concealed or misplaced, while later dynasties attempted to fabricate their own water clocks. They never quite attained the identical degree of intricacy or astronomical integration witnessed within the Kaifeng Tower. The particular understanding of the liquid-propelled escapement was largely expunged from the Chinese chronicle. By the era, the initial European mechanical chronometers arrived in China during the 16th century. The local authorities were astonished by their novel technology, evidently oblivious that their own forebears had mastered the identical principles 5 centuries earlier. Recreating the tower presently has illustrated to us that the cosmic engine exceeded merely a chronometer. It was a simulation of the natural world. The utilization of water as an energy origin was an intentional selection to synchronize the machine with the flow of nature. Modern reproductions within museums demonstrate the sheer physical existence of the machine, yet they frequently grapple to replicate the dependability of the original. We can fabricate the cogwheels with laser-cut precision, yet preserving the exact timing through the drip of water into a wooden container persists as a challenging accomplishment for modern horologists. It demands a degree of patience and observational proficiency that the digital age has largely distanced itself from. While the engineers of the Song dynasty were employing water to monitor the motions of the stars, the Byzantine Empire was utilizing a different variety of liquid to safeguard the frontiers of their capital. This substance was Greek fire, a horrifying armament that secured the survival of the Eastern Roman Empire for centuries. Initially materializing during the 7th century AD, Greek fire was a liquid that combusted with fierce heat and could not be extinguished by water. In fact, it actually persisted to blaze while floating upon the ocean exterior. It operated as the ultimate naval deterrent, permitting the Byzantine navy to incinerate adversary fleets before they could breach the ramparts of Constantinople. The chronicle of this weapon is concentrated upon a particular instant of crisis. During the year 673, an enormous naval armada launched an assault against Constantinople. The Byzantines were vastly outnumbered and seemed on the verge of collapse. According to historical records, a refugee named Callinicos of Heliopolis reached the city escaping conflict in Syria. He presented the emperor with a novel creation, a liquid flame that could be projected from vessels. This was not a primitive fire arrow or a simple container of burning oil. It was a refined chemical weapon system that altered the character of maritime warfare. The science of Greek fire encompassed 2 separate constituents: the chemical concoction itself and the mechanical arrangement utilized to deploy it. The delivery mechanism was a pressurized bronze pump recognized as a siphon. This functioned quite similarly to a contemporary flamethrower. Byzantine engineers would heat the liquid within a sealed cauldron and then employ a manual pump to compel it through a bronze spout mounted upon the prow of the vessel. The pressure allowed the Byzantines to spray a stream of fire across a span of several dozen yards. Because the liquid was under pressure, it exited the spout with an audible roaring sound that observers characterized as resembling thunder. This mechanical portion of the arrangement demanded an elevated degree of metalworking proficiency. The pumps necessitated being airtight and robust enough to manage both the heat of the boiling liquid and the pressure required to launch it. If the seals upon the bronze conduits malfunctioned, the weapon proved equally hazardous to the Byzantine mariners as it was to the foe. We now understand this was inaccurate. In 2023, a pivotal investigation directed by Admir Masick at MIT disclosed an alternate procedure recognized as hot mixing. Through examining microscopic specimens of Roman concrete from the walls of Privernum, investigators discovered minute white mineral fragments identified as lime clasts. Previously, archaeologists disregarded these as proof of inadequate blending or inferior grade substances. Masick's team ascertained that these clasts were the outcome of blending quicklime directly with the volcanic ash and water at exceptionally elevated temperatures. This hot mixing procedure generated a substance that was not chemically uniform, but instead encompassed these reactive reservoirs of calcium. These lime clasts furnish the concrete with a self-repairing capacity. When a microscopic fissure forms within a Roman wall due to seismic activity or the pounding of the ocean, water infiltrates the crevice. As the water contacts a lime clast, it dissolves the calcium, producing a solution that rapidly recrystallizes. This novel mineral growth fills the fracture and seals the construction, effectively mending the impairment from the interior outward before it can precipitate a significant structural collapse. This clarifies why the Pantheon, with its immense unreinforced concrete dome, has endured for centuries without collapsing beneath its own mass or disintegrating from environmental strain. The military and civic engineers of the Roman Empire cultivated this system because they confronted an urgent necessity for stable infrastructure across an immense domain. As Rome expanded, it demanded dependable deep water harbors to provision its legions and its burgeoning metropolitan populations. Traditional stone masonry was excessively sluggish and costly for the magnitude of construction required. By employing concrete, Roman engineers could cast colossal structures in situ, even submerged. They utilized wooden molds to contain the mixture, which would solidify and harden irrespective of the ocean's presence, permitting them to construct ports where no natural protection existed. One of the most renowned applications of this technology is the Pantheon in Rome, finalized under Emperor Hadrian around 126 AD. The dome constitutes a marvel of material weight administration. At the foundation, the concrete is dense and blended with heavy basalt aggregate to deliver strength. As the dome ascends toward the central aperture, the engineers transition to lighter aggregates like porous pumice to diminish the mass. This stratified arrangement of density enabled them to erect a dome spanning over 43 meters devoid of any interior support beams. Other notable edifices incorporate the baths of Caracalla and the markets of Trajan, which utilized immense concrete vaults to generate a multi-level indoor commercial complex. The performance of this concrete within marine surroundings was further investigated by the Roman Concrete Project, an international research enterprise that expended over a decade testing Roman-style concrete in diverse oceanic circumstances. They discovered that salt water indeed functions as a catalyst for the concrete strength. Whenever seawater penetrates the concrete, it reacts with the volcanic ash to generate a rare mineral termed aluminum tobermorite. These crystals develop within the concrete across hundreds of years, interlacing through the substance like a microscopic lattice. While modern concrete is ultimately demolished by the ocean, Roman concrete utilizes the minerals within the water to weave itself together more tightly. The individuals behind this were the architecti and ats mensores, the architects and surveyors of the Roman legions. They were highly mobile and conveyed their technical manuals from one extremity of the empire to the other. Their objective was standardized durability. They required assurance that a bridge constructed in Britain would be equally dependable as a sanctuary in North Africa. The employment of standardized recipes and the hot mixing technique permitted them to attain a degree of quality control that sustained the empire's infrastructure for centuries. The forfeiture of this technology was not the consequence of a singular occurrence, but rather the disintegration of the specialized supply chains that supported it. The essential component, pozzolana ash, had to be transported in massive quantities from the Bay of Naples to construction sites across the Mediterranean. As the Western Roman Empire started to fracture during the 5th century AD, these maritime transportation networks faltered. Local builders forfeited access to the volcanic ash and the specialized quicklime necessary for hot mixing. Without the correct raw materials, they reverted to employing simpler lime mortars, which lacked the hydraulic attributes and self-repairing catalysts of the original Roman mixture. As the technical comprehension of the Ars architecti faded, the secret of Roman concrete became a legend. Throughout the Middle Ages, builders observed Roman ruins and believed they were the labor of giants because they could not replicate the hardness of the stone. It required nearly 1,300 years for hydraulic cement to be rediscovered. And even then, the industrial iterations we fabricated concentrated on speed and strength in the short term rather than the multi-generational durability of the Roman methodology. Modern investigators are now endeavoring to replicate this ancient chemical formula to resolve a contemporary crisis. The manufacture of modern Portland cement is accountable for approximately 8% of global carbon dioxide emissions. By adopting the Roman approach of utilizing volcanic ash and self-repairing lime clasts, engineers aspire to generate a novel generation of concrete that persists longer and demands significantly less upkeep. If an edifice can endure for 200 years instead of 50, the environmental expense of construction is drastically diminished. We have successfully deciphered the chemical formula of the lime clasts, yet we still grapple to mass-produce this substance as efficiently as the Romans did. Our modern construction sector is founded upon the standardization of Portland cement, and reverting to a reactive hot, mixed material necessitates a fundamental alteration in how we manufacture and convey building materials. We can observe the outcomes of their genius within the piers of the Mediterranean. Yet reconstructing the industrial lineage that created them is a gradual process of trial and error. While the builders of the Roman Empire were employing concrete to erect monuments that ascended high above the terrain, a distinct variety of engineering was already established beneath the soil of central Italy. Long before the initial Roman aqueduct was ever conceived, a civilization recognized as the Etruscans had cultivated a sophisticated technique of managing the landscape. They generated a subterranean network of conduits termed cuniculi. These were not elementary drains or sewers. They were an immense integrated hydraulic system engineered to regulate the water table across thousands of square miles of what is presently Tuscany and Latium. The Etruscans were a culture that surfaced during the Iron Age approximately around 900 BC within the region of north-central Italy known as Etruria. While their origins persist a topic of debate among historians, their influence upon the development of Western civilization is undeniable. They were a loose confederation of 12 autonomous city-states, each a regional authority with its own monarch and administration. Unlike the later centralized Roman Empire, the Etruscans functioned as a cultural and religious bloc, bound by a shared language that was entirely unrelated to the Latin spoken by their neighbors. They were a maritime populace controlling the Tyrrhenian Sea and trading extensively with the Greeks and Phoenicians. This contact with the broader Mediterranean world permitted them to import concepts in art, religion, and metallurgy which they then adapted into a unique cultural identity. By the 7th century BC, the Etruscans had become one of the wealthiest and most technologically progressive societies in the Mediterranean. They were masters of bronze work and jewelry. Yet their most impressive accomplishments were in the field of land management. They inhabited a landscape dominated by volcanic activity where the earth was composed of tough, solidified volcanic ash. While this stone was simple to carve, the topography was challenging to cultivate. The Etruscans settled upon high plateaus for defense, yet the valleys beneath were prone to flooding and the formation of stagnant pools. To transform this difficult terrain into a productive heartland, they cultivated a degree of hydraulic proficiency that was arguably more advanced than anything discovered in the contemporary Greek or Egyptian worlds. For an extensive duration, investigators presumed the hue alteration was a chemical anomaly or the consequence of a fortunate mishap within the furnace. It was not until the late 20th century that we possessed the instruments essential to gaze inside the glass and comprehend the physical actuality of its fabrication. In 1990, investigators at the British Museum executed a detailed examination to ascertain precisely what transpired inside the glass matrix. A team led by N. Freestone employed a transmission electron microscope to scrutinize microscopic fragments that had been extracted from the chalice during a prior restoration. They discovered that the glass was infused with a minuscule quantity of silver and gold particles. These metals were not merely blended into the glass within a traditional context. They were suspended as nanoparticles. The Roman artisans had pulverized these metals down to a dimension of 70 nanometers, which is approximately 1,000th the magnitude of a grain of salt. The science underlying this color transformation, recognized as surface plasmon resonance, is intricate. When illumination strikes these particular metal particles, the electrons upon the surface of the gold and silver oscillate in a manner that disperses shorter wavelengths of light like blue and green. This explains why the chalice appears green when light reflects off the exterior. However, when light traverses through the glass from the rear, these identical nanoparticles permit longer wavelengths, such as red, to penetrate while obstructing the others. This degree of precision necessitated the Romans to master a particular ratio of metals, approximately 330 parts per million of silver to 40 parts per million of gold. This exact equilibrium implies that the Romans were not simply discarding metal filings into a vat. Instead, they had cultivated a highly regulated chemical procedure to guarantee the particles were distributed uniformly throughout the glass melt. If the particles were excessively large, or if the concentration deviated by even a minor margin, the dichroic effect would malfunction. The glass would simply appear murky, opaque, or a singular unchanging color. The uniformity of the Lycurgus cup suggests the existence of a profoundly specialized guild of glassmakers who comprehended the exact heating and cooling cycles required to cultivate these nanoparticles within the glass. The artisans who created this were part of the specialized Roman glassmaking guilds that thrived during the late Empire. These guilds were frequently secretive, transmitting their recipes and techniques down through a master-apprentice framework. The purpose of the chalice was almost certainly a demonstration of imperial prestige. By employing technology to emulate the color of wine and depict a myth regarding the deity of wine, the Romans were displaying their capacity to manipulate the natural world for the pleasure of the elite. It was a demonstration of luxury that doubled as a high-stakes engineering accomplishment engineered to impress attendees at the most exclusive imperial banquets. The forfeiture of this technology coincided with the broader fragmentation of the Roman Empire during the 5th century. As the imperial structure disintegrated, the centralized glasswork started to deteriorate. The particular supply chains for high-purity gold and silver, as well as the specialized knowledge required to grind them into nanoparticles, vanished as the economic centers of the Mediterranean shifted. Without a written record of the chemical formula, the craft of dichroic glassmaking was forfeited. The understanding of nanometallurgy effectively disappeared from the historical chronicle for nearly 1600 years. Throughout the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, glassmakers attempted to replicate the ruby hues observed in antique Roman artifacts, yet they rarely attained the identical dichroic properties. They frequently employed copper or distinct iron oxides which produced a red glass, yet it remained red irrespective of the lighting direction. It was not until the late 19th century that chemists started to comprehend the function of colloidal metals in glass coloration, and even then they lacked the capability to measure the particles at the nanoscale. During the late 20th century, scientists at NASA rediscovered an analogous dichroic coating technology for application in satellite mirrors and astronaut helmet visors. These modern applications employ thin layers of metal to reflect harmful radiation while permitting visible light to penetrate, operating upon the identical physical principles discovered within the Lycurgus cup. While we can replicate the chalice today utilizing laboratory-grade apparatus and computer-regulated heating, we cannot entirely clarify how the Romans achieved such molecular precision within a traditional workshop environment devoid of modern chemical sensors or thermometers. The existence of the chalice compels a reevaluation of the technical limits of the 4th century. It demonstrates that ancient craftsmen were capable of executing what we now designate material science. Even if they described the procedure in different terms, they were not merely shaping glass. They were engineering its interaction with illumination at a level that humanity would not achieve again until the era of space exploration. The Lycurgus cup persists as a physical record of a sophisticated technical zenith that was attained, mastered, and then completely forgotten. While the artisans of the Roman Empire were experimenting with the molecular properties of light, engineers in the East were concentrated upon a different fundamental challenge, the mechanical regulation of time. During the year 1080, throughout the Song dynasty, a polymath named Su Song commenced construction upon a machine that would remain the most advanced timekeeping apparatus on Earth for nearly 3 centuries. This was the cosmic engine, an immense water-propelled clock tower situated within the capital of Kaifeng. It stood approximately 40 feet elevated and functioned as a celestial observatory, an imperial calendar, and a public timekeeper, all powered by a continuous flow of water. The discovery of Su Song's accomplishment arrived largely through his own meticulously preserved records. Within his treatise, the Xin Yishang Fa Yao, he furnished detailed diagrams and explanations of the internal operations of the tower. For an extensive period, historians believed that the escapement, the critical mechanism that permits a clock to tick at a regular interval, was a European invention from the 14th century. However, Su Song's writings substantiated that Chinese engineers had mastered a liquid-propelled version of this technology hundreds of years earlier. This heavenly balance escapement was the heart of the machine, and it symbolizes a degree of mechanical sophistication that contests our presumptions regarding 11th century technology. The science of the cosmic engine relied upon a sequence of nested reservoirs and an immense water wheel featuring 36 individual buckets. To maintain the clock accurate, the water pressure had to remain perfectly consistent irrespective of the water level within the primary supply. Su Song achieved this by employing a constant, level tank. Water would flow from a primary reservoir into a smaller tank that possessed an overflow notch. Because the water within the smaller tank was perpetually at the identical height, the pressure at the base remained identical. This ensured a steady, unchanging drip into the buckets of the main wheel, resolving the problem of mechanical drift provoked by fluctuating water pressure. Whenever each bucket upon the colossal wheel filled with water, it would ultimately attain a particular weight that activated the escapement mechanism. This was a system of equilibrium levers and gates. The revelation of the cuniculi discloses that the Etruscans were the principal architects of the Italian landscape preceding the ascent of the Roman Republic. Residing within states such as Veii and Tarquinia, they comprehended that the key to metropolitan expansion was agricultural surplus. To accomplish this, they initiated an ambitious endeavor to drain the earth. By carving tunnels directly into the volcanic tuff, they could divert surplus groundwater into adjacent rivers. This constituted a form of passive engineering. They were not pumping water. They were simply generating a novel pathway for it to pursue. This permitted them to reclaim thousands of acres of marshy valley floors, converting them into the most fertile grain-producing territories within Italy. The technical challenge of excavating these tunnels was substantial. To guarantee that water flowed consistently without eroding the tunnel floor or stagnating, the Etruscans had to preserve an exact gradient. Within many of the cuniculi surveyed around the ancient city of Veii, engineers managed to preserve a slope of precisely 1 degree across distances of several miles. Attaining this degree of precision while laboring in complete darkness hundreds of feet underground demanded a rigorous application of basic physics and surveying. It implies that the Etruscans possessed a specialized class of engineers who devoted their lives to mastering the behavior of water and the structural attributes of volcanic rock. To remain on course, the Etruscan excavators utilized a system of vertical shafts recognized as pozzi. These were wells sunk from the surface downward to the intended root of the tunnel at regular intervals, frequently spaced approximately 30 to 50 yards apart. These shafts furnished essential ventilation for the laborers and allowed for the efficient elimination of excavated stone. However, their most significant function was as a fixed reference point for surveying. By suspending plumb lines, elementary lead weights upon strings down these vertical shafts, the workers could establish a vertical baseline. This permitted them to verify their depth and direction against the surface terrain, ensuring that the tunnel did not deviate into a hill or descend too precipitously into a ravine. To preserve the horizontal direction and the specific 1-degree slope between two shafts, the excavators employed fire sightings. They would position oil lamps within a straight row along the tunnel floor. By gazing backward toward the preceding shaft and aligning the flames, they could ensure the tunnel did not drift left or right. The gradient was likely verified utilizing a water level. A common instrument of the era was a lengthy wooden trough filled with water. As long as the water remained a specific distance from the trough's top at both extremities, the workers understood they were preserving their intended slope. This methodical procedure permitted teams digging from opposite ends to converge in the middle with a margin of error of merely a few inches, a feat of coordination that demanded exact timing and communication between the surface and the subterranean teams. Our contemporary comprehension of the sheer magnitude of this labor commenced during the 1960s with the pioneering surveys of Sheldon Judson and Ann Kahn. They documented thousands of miles of these tunnels, many of which had been forgotten for over 2,000 years. In recent years, investigators have employed LiDAR technology to chart the tunnels more accurately. By utilizing laser-equipped aircraft to scan the ground surface, they can detect the subtle depressions left by the vertical pozzi shafts, even when those shafts are concealed beneath dense forest or modern edifices. Within the area encircling Veii alone, LiDAR has disclosed a labyrinth of channels that demonstrates the Etruscans were managing the water of an entire region as a singular project. The Etruscans were not merely digging for the sake of drainage. They were generating a sustainable environment. The funiculi also functioned as a dependable source of water throughout the arid summer months. Because the tunnels were carved into porous tuff, they operated as a horizontal well, accumulating the water that naturally filtered through the rock. This accumulated water was then employed for irrigation and even metropolitan consumption. This dual-purpose design, drainage during the winter and accumulation during the summer, is a testament to a holistic approach to civil engineering that balanced the necessities of the city with the cycles of the seasons. The decline of this technology initiated with the rise of Rome. When the Roman Republic ultimately conquered the Etruscan city of Veii in 390, 6 before the Common Era, they inherited the landscape but failed to maintain the infrastructure beneath it. The funiculi were not self-sustaining. They demanded regular manual labor to clear out the silt and debris that washed in during heavy rains. As the Romans concentrated their energy upon erecting more conspicuous monuments and expanding their frontiers through military conquest, the maintenance of the Etruscan tunnels was disregarded. The Roman emphasis was upon the grand and the public, frequently at the expense of the subtle, imperceptible systems that preserved the land healthy. Within a few centuries, many of the tunnels became clogged with sediment. The water ceased flowing and the valleys reverted to their natural marshy state. This environmental alteration had a direct impact upon the health of the region. The stagnant water within the neglected valleys became a breeding ground for mosquitoes, leading to the resurgence of malaria. This disease became a chronic problem for the Roman countryside, recurring for centuries and substantially affecting the population and the economy of the empire. Historians frequently indicate the Pontine marshes of Italy as a tragic example of what transpires when a sophisticated drainage system is permitted to decay. The forfeiture of the Etruscan hydraulic comprehension converted a productive garden into a biological hazard that would plague the Italian peninsula until the modern era. While the Romans eventually constructed their own aqueducts to convey fresh water into the city, those systems were engineered for a different purpose. The Roman aqueducts transported water under pressure across extensive distances to supply public baths and fountains. In contrast, the Etruscan funiculi were a form of passive environmental engineering engineered to operate with the natural water table. The Romans borrowed the concept of the spazzi shafts and the gradient techniques for their own projects, yet they never quite matched the Etruscan concentration upon total landscape drainage. The Etruscans perceived the earth as something to be balanced, whereas the Romans perceived it as something to be conquered and reshaped. Presently, engineers regard the funiculi as a significant accomplishment in sustainable land management. While we can now compute these gradients utilizing digital levels and laser guides, the fact that a civilization was capable of attaining this through manual excavation and simple fire sightings is a testament to their observational proficiencies. We comprehend the purpose of the tunnels, but the manual precision required to excavate them with such accuracy devoid of modern surveying equipment persists as a point of interest for historians of technology. The funiculi stand as a physical record of a civilization that altered the earth itself to suit its requirements, only for that earth to reclaim itself once the technical comprehension was forfeited. While the engineers of Central Italy were perfecting the drainage of the earth, the Maya of Central America were gazing in the opposite direction. Within the tropical lowlands of contemporary Mexico, Guatemala, and Belize, a civilization developed that perceived the movement of the heavens as the primary blueprint for human existence. The Maya were not merely observers of the stars. They were obsessive mathematicians who monitored the cycles of the sun, moon, and planets with a degree of precision that contests our comprehension of pre-telescopic science. Their technical legacy is recorded within immense stone monuments and a few surviving bark, paper books that disclose a sophisticated grasp of orbital mechanics. The discovery of the profundity of Mayan astronomy initiated with the analysis of the Dresden Codex, one of only 4 surviving Mayan books. The majority of the Mayan libraries were annihilated throughout the Spanish conquest, yet this specific document found its path to Europe during the 18th century. It encompasses complex tables monitoring the movements of the planet Venus across several centuries. When investigators started to decode these inscriptions alongside the carvings upon monuments at sites like Copan and Chichen Itza, they realized that the Maya were employing a system of interlocking calendars to map time upon both a human and a cosmic scale. The Mayan approach to time was defined by 2 primary cycles, the Tzolk'in and the Wahab. The Tzolk'in was a 260-day ritual calendar likely based upon the human gestation period or the agricultural cycle of the highlands. The Arzhab was a 365-day solar calendar analogous to our own, though it did not utilize a leap year. Instead, these 2 cycles operated together like 2 meshing gears. Every 18,980 days, roughly 52 years, the 2 calendars would revert to their original starting positions, a cycle recognized as the calendar round. This system permitted the Maya to manage the daily necessities of their society. Yet for monitoring the profound history of the universe, they cultivated the long count. The long count was a linear tally of days that commenced at a fixed point within the distant past, specifically August 11th, 3114 before the Common Era. This calendar was founded upon a vigesimal or base 20 numbering system. This generates an ascending current that extracts warm air from the interior chambers, much like a chimney extracts smoke from a hearth. When a zephyr exists, the tower propels cool air downward. When the air remains motionless, the tower extracts warm air upward. This dual action arrangement guarantees that the air inside a Persian dwelling is perpetually being revitalized, sustaining a temperature that is markedly lower than the external air. In numerous instances, the efficacy of the wind catcher was amplified by its connection to another antique Persian innovation, the wefkanat. These are subterranean water conduits that convey snowmelt from distant mountains to the metropolis. The wind catcher was frequently positioned directly above an aperture to the wefkanat. As the arid desert air was funneled downward along the shaft, it traversed over the cold flowing water. This procedure of evaporative cooling removed the heat from the air and augmented moisture, yielding a chilled breeze that felt remarkably similar to contemporary air conditioning. This integrated arrangement of air and water administration permitted the creation of underground chambers or sardab where inhabitants could remain comfortable even during the most sweltering portion of the day. The architects who formulated this technology were specialists in local microclimates. They comprehended that a wind catcher in Yazd, where the wind typically blows from one direction, demanded a distinct design compared to a tower in a coastal metropolis where the winds are more variable. They modified the height of the towers, the quantity of apertures, and the internal partitions to calibrate each construction to its specific location. This constituted a highly specialized form of regional comprehension that relied upon generations of observation and a profound understanding of aerodynamics. Contemporary scientific interest in these towers originated during the 1970s with the labor of investigators like Midi Bahadori. He executed extensive thermal and aerodynamic examinations upon the wind catchers of Yazd, validating their efficiency through empirical evidence. More recently, computational fluid dynamics simulations have affirmed his discoveries. These modern simulations demonstrate that traditional wind catchers are frequently more efficient at cooling substantial volumes of air than numerous mechanical systems, specifically because they utilize the natural energy of the wind and the thermal mass of the building materials. Despite their efficiency, the utilization of wind catchers started to diminish during the mid-20th century. The arrival of inexpensive electricity and the widespread accessibility of Western-style mechanical air conditioning units altered how individuals contemplated building design. Residents discovered it simpler to install a motorized unit than to maintain the large vertical shafts of a wind catcher. Additionally, the transition toward modern international-style architecture implied that many new edifices were constructed employing materials like concrete and glass, which do not possess the identical thermal attributes as the traditional sun-dried mud bricks utilized in Yazd. Consequently of this transition, many of the older towers have deteriorated. Because they are fabricated from earthen materials, they necessitate regular upkeep to shield them from the occasional desert precipitations and the erosive force of the wind. Whenever a residence is abandoned or converted to employ mechanical cooling, the wind catcher is frequently neglected. Over time, the internal partitions can collapse and the construction forfeits its capacity to function. The forfeiture is not solely architectural. It is the forfeiture of a specialized manner of existing in equilibrium with the desert environment. In recent years, a renewed interest has emerged in this technology among sustainable architects. Within metropolises like Dubai and certain regions of Iran, engineers are reintegrating contemporary iterations of the wind catcher into high-rise buildings and commercial centers. These ventilation towers employ the identical principles of pressure and the stack effect, but are constructed with modern materials and occasionally supplemented with minor fans to guarantee airflow on entirely still days. They are being utilized to reduce the carbon footprint of large edifices by furnishing a form of passive cooling that significantly lowers energy consumption. While we possess the mathematical models to comprehend precisely how a wind catcher functions, we have forfeited much of the specific regional intuition that the ancient architects possessed. They could observe a parcel of land, consider the surrounding edifices and the local wind patterns, and know precisely how elevated a tower should be or which direction it should confront. That degree of calibration was a consequence of a continuous lineage of comprehension that was severed when mechanical cooling became the norm. Relearning these subtleties is a gradual procedure that obligates us to gaze back upon these desert towers with a fresh appreciation for their technical complexity. The capacity of the Persians to regulate the temperature of their surroundings employing solely the wind and the earth mirrors the accomplishments of other ancient civilizations in different domains. While the Persians were mastering the movement of air, the Romans were developing a substance that permitted them to construct upon a scale never witnessed before. This was Roman concrete, or opus caementicium. Unlike modern concrete, which frequently starts to degrade following 50 to 100 years, Roman structures have remained intact for over 2 millennia. This longevity is especially evident within their maritime engineering, where ancient harbors have been submerged in salt water for 2,000 years and have actually grown more robust over time. Preceding the development of this volcanic mixture, Mediterranean builders relied principally upon ashlar masonry, large hand-cut blocks of stone held together by gravity, or simple lime mortars. This traditional technique was extremely labor-intensive and restricted the magnitude of the structures that could be erected. A wall fabricated from cut stone is solely as robust as the friction between the blocks. When the Romans introduced a pourable hydraulic concrete, it altered the fundamental rationale of construction. Instead of stacking individual pieces, They could generate a singular monolithic mass of artificial stone. This permitted the creation of immense interior spaces and enormous vaults that were previously impossible to support utilizing traditional brick or stone. For decades, engineers presumed that Roman concrete was simply a more primitive iteration of modern Portland cement. We believe the Romans were merely fortunate to possess access to high-quality raw materials. However, modern structures erected in seawater frequently crumble as the salt corrodes the steel reinforcements and the water leaches away the binding agents. In contrast, Roman breakwaters and piers persist intact. This instigated a massive shift in how we perceive ancient civil engineering. Instead of a static material, Roman concrete is a reactive one that undergoes a continuous chemical evolution throughout its existence. The nucleus of this technology was a specific mixture of quicklime and volcanic ash recognized as pozzolana. The Romans sourced this ash primarily from the region encircling the Bay of Naples, particularly adjacent to Mount Vesuvius. When these materials were blended with water, a pozzolanic reaction transpired that generated a durable stone-like substance. Yet the genuine secret, which remained a mystery until very recently, was the method of mixing. For centuries, historians believe the Romans meticulously mixed their lime into a smooth paste before adding it to the ash. The Maya utilized units designated as kin signifying days, oinal signifying 20 days, tons for 360 days, catons for 7,200 days, and bactons for 144,000 days. By employing this framework, they could chronicle dates millions of years into the past or the future. It was this arrangement that permitted them to execute the sophisticated astronomical computations that have captivated contemporary investigators. One of the most phenomenal accomplishments of Mayan science was their computation of the Venus cycle. The synodic cycle constitutes the duration required for Venus to revert to the identical position within the sky as perceived from Earth. Modern measurements situate this cycle at roughly 583.92 days. The Mayan priest astronomers across centuries of naked eye observation calculated this as 584 days. To accommodate the fractional discrepancy, they devised a correction mechanism that was employed over thousands of years. Recent examination of their tables implies they managed an error of merely 1 day in 6,000 years. This degree of orbital precision was attained without the assistance of telescopes, timepieces, or even metal implements. The individuals accountable for these computations were the Ash-kin, the priest, astronomers of the Mayan courts. They perceived time as a cyclical divine force where occurrences of the past were anticipated to recur in the future provided the cosmic circumstances were identical. Their primary objective was to furnish the ruling elite with flawless celestial alignments for political ceremonies, military campaigns, and agricultural planning. Within the Mayan worldview, a monarch's legitimacy was linked to his capacity to synchronize his actions with the motions of the deities, who were frequently personified by the planets. Venus specifically was associated with warfare, and its manifestation as the morning star frequently dictated the timing of significant raids or battles. Scientific investigation of these calendars was pioneered during the 20th century by researchers like J. Eric S. Thompson and subsequently by Anthony Aveni, who is considered the father of modern archaeoastronomy. Thompson assisted in bridging the divide between Mayan glyphs and the Western calendar, while Aveni concentrated upon the orientation of Mayan edifices. He discovered that many structures, such as the Caracol at Chichen Itza or the governor's palace at Oxmal, were precisely aligned to the ascending and descending points of Venus at its most extreme positions upon the horizon. These buildings were essentially stone instruments engineered to capture the motions of the heavens and inscribe them for posterity. A significant breakthrough transpired in 2012 with the revelation of a minor dwelling within the ruins of Zoltan, Guatemala. Inside, archaeologists discovered a chamber where the walls were adorned with fine, line paintings and mathematical notations. Unlike the formal inscriptions upon stone monuments, these appeared to be the authentic worksheets of Mayan astronomers. They contained tables charting the cycles of the moon, Mars and Venus, as well as the dates for future eclipses. This discovery supplied a rare glimpse at the active scribal procedure, demonstrating that the Maya were persistently refining their data through observation and correction. The mathematics employed within these computations was highly advanced. The Maya were one of the sole ancient civilizations to independently uncover the concept of zero, which they represented with a shell, like glyph. Their base 20 system utilized only 3 symbols: a dot for 1, a bar for 5, and the shell for 0. This simple notation permitted them to execute complex addition and subtraction and to manage the immense numbers required for the long count. The existence of these worksheets at Zoltan implies that Mayan astronomers were executing a type of data-driven science that would be recognizable to a modern investigator. The forfeiture of this mathematical heritage was a direct consequence of the Spanish conquest during the 16th century. In 1562, at the town of Mani, a Franciscan friar named Diego de Landa commanded the incineration of thousands of Mayan books. He perceived the codices as superstition and falsehoods of the devil and sought to expunge the traditional comprehension of the Maya to assist in their conversion to Christianity. Within a solitary afternoon, the vast majority of Mayan history, science, and mathematics was diminished to ash. While the calendars survived upon the stone facades of monuments and within the memories of the people, the detailed records clarifying how they performed their computations were largely annihilated. Following the collapse of the classic Mayan civilization during the 9th century AD, many of the great cities were abandoned and reclaimed by the jungle. The specialized lineage of priests, astronomers was fractured and much of the advanced mathematical understanding faded. By the era the Spanish arrived, the Maya were still utilizing the 260-day and 365-day calendars, but the deep time computations of the long count had largely fallen into disuse. The destruction of the books by de Landa ensured that the specific mathematical rationale behind their precision remained a mystery for nearly 4 centuries. Modern attempts to replicate Mayan calculations have demonstrated precisely how rigorous their methodology was. We can verify their data employing supercomputers and satellite observations, confirming that their orbital tracks for the planets were incredibly accurate. However, we cannot entirely clarify how they attained this without lenses or mechanical timekeepers. It appears they relied upon a technique of long-term averaging where they recorded observations over hundreds of years and then computed the median. This demanded a degree of intergenerational record, keeping in patience that is uncommon within the history of science. The Mayan calendars stand as a testament to a civilization that perceived the universe as a complex, orderly machine. They were capable of observing the chaotic motions of the planets and discovering the underlying mathematical rhythms. While their cities are presently ruins, their computations remain etched in stone, furnishing a record of an era when the human intellect was capable of mapping the solar system through observation alone. This concentration upon the heavens and the patterns of time was not exclusive to the Maya, but their degree of mathematical rigor distinguishes them from almost any other ancient culture. While the Maya were charting the infinite cycles of the stars, a different variety of technological progress was occurring within Northern Europe. Upon the medieval battlefields of the 9th through the 11th centuries, A particular type of weapon started to appear that seemed to defy the metallurgical standards of its era. These were the Ulfbert swords. Approximately 170 of these blades have been discovered dispersed across Scandinavia and Northern Europe, all distinguished by a singular name stamped into the steel Ulfbert. These swords were so superior to the standard weaponry of the epoch that they functioned as the high-tech military hardware of the Viking Age. To comprehend why these swords constituted such a departure from the norm, it is essential to observe the condition of European metallurgy during the early Middle Ages. Most blacksmiths of this epoch labored within small localized forges serving a specific village or lord. They employed bloomery furnaces, which were essentially clay chimneys filled with alternating strata of iron, ore, and charcoal. These furnaces could not attain the temperatures required to fully melt iron. Instead, they generated a bloom, a spongy, incandescent mass of iron intermixed with pockets of sand and stone recognized as slag. The existence of a medieval blacksmith was defined by the grueling duty of refining this bloom. They had to hammer the glowing mass repeatedly to squeeze out the liquid slag, a procedure that was never 100% effective, because the iron was never authentically liquid. The carbon from the charcoal was unevenly distributed. This resulted in weapons that were either excessively soft and prone to bending or excessively brittle and prone to shattering upon impact. To compensate for these weaknesses, smiths employed pattern welding. They would twist together multiple rods of different iron grades, creating the characteristic serpent or herringbone patterns witnessed upon many Viking-era blades. While beautiful and functional, these were complex workarounds for a fundamental deficiency of high-quality steel. The Ulfbert swords represented a complete rupture from this tradition. These blades were likely produced within the Frankish Empire, specifically within the Rhineland region of contemporary Germany. This signified that each vessel outfitted with the apparatus had to convey a specialized team of engineers who comprehended how to preserve the pressure and administer the volatile chemicals securely throughout the turmoil of a maritime engagement. The chemical characteristics of the substance were specifically engineered for naval warfare. Most conflagrations of the epoch could be extinguished with a container of seawater, but Greek fire actually responded to water with greater intensity. It was described as an adhesive blaze, signifying it would adhere to the wooden hulls of ships and the garments of sailors. Once ignited, it was nearly impossible to eliminate. Historical narratives suggest that solely 3 substances could dependably extinguish the flames: substantial quantities of sand, potent vinegar, or human urine. These particular prerequisites indicate a complex chemical composition that contemporary investigators are still attempting to categorize. During the 20th century, historians and chemists commenced conducting serious forensic examination upon the surviving depictions of the weapon. Investigators such as John Haldon and Maurice Byrne have concentrated upon the chemical signatures referenced within Byzantine texts. The prevailing theory is that the foundation of the mixture was crude oil or naphtha, which was naturally accessible within the regions surrounding the Black Sea. To this, the Byzantines likely incorporated resins to render the liquid viscous and sulfur to augment the heat of the flame. A more contentious portion of the theory involves the utilization of quicklime. Whenever quicklime contacts water, it generates a chemical reaction that produces significant heat. If the Byzantines had discovered a method to suspend quicklime within the oil foundation, the act of spraying the liquid over the ocean would have activated an automatic ignition as soon as the mixture struck the seawater. This would elucidate why the fire seemed to ignite upon the water's surface. However, Preserving such a mixture stable within a liquid state without it reacting prematurely within the tank would have necessitated an advanced comprehension of chemistry. The application of Greek fire was rigorously regulated by the Byzantine administration. The formula was regarded as a sacred secret that guaranteed the security of the empire. Emperor Constantine V. Suri proceeded so far as to assert that the secret of the fire had been disclosed to the first Emperor Constantine by an angel. He cautioned that any official who divulged the secret would be stricken by divine lightning. This was not merely religious discourse. It was a method to preserve a strategic monopoly. The understanding was so fragmented that no singular individual knew the entire procedure. One family might understand how to refine the oil, another how to construct the bronze pumps, and another how to blend the final additives. This extreme secrecy is the primary rationale the technology was forfeited. The Byzantine framework was highly centralized. But as the empire started to disintegrate throughout the 11th and 12th centuries, these specialized groups of craftsmen were dispersed. Throughout the Fourth Crusade in 1204, when Constantinople was assailed by Western Europeans, much of the city's infrastructure was annihilated. The secret was never documented in entirety, and as the specific families who held the different fragments of the formula perished, the capability to produce the weapon vanished. By the era the Ottoman Turks seized the city in 1453, the Byzantines had forfeited the secret to their most potent weapon, abandoning them to defend their ramparts devoid of their celebrated fire. The impact of Greek fire upon the map of the world cannot be exaggerated. For over 500 years, it functioned as a technological barrier that impeded various caliphates from expanding into Europe via the Mediterranean. Because the Byzantines could incinerate entire fleets, they possessed a naval supremacy that permitted their culture and administrative systems to endure far longer than they otherwise would have. The forfeiture of the secret was not merely a forfeiture of a chemical recipe. It was the forfeiture of the empire's primary insurance policy. Contemporary attempts to recreate Greek fire have been frequent, yet largely unsuccessful. We can generate liquids that combust upon water such as napalm, but these rely upon modern synthetic materials and jellied gasoline. Whenever investigators attempt to construct a variant utilizing solely 7th century substances like sulfur, oil, and resins, they struggle to replicate the adhesive quality and the specific roaring combustion described within the texts. No modern recreation has flawlessly matched the historical observation that the substance could combust beneath the water's surface, a feat that suggests a component within the mixture that supplied its own oxygen. The Polynesian voyages and the reconstruction of Susong's clock demonstrated that we can frequently recover mechanical or navigational systems through trial and error. But Greek fire symbolizes a chemical forfeiture that is considerably more challenging to reverse. Without the exact ratios and the specific local sources of the raw materials, the authentic Greek fire persists as a mystery. It stands as a unique illustration of a state secret so well guarded that it successfully prevented both adversaries and future generations from ever genuinely comprehending it. And while the Byzantines were employing heat as a weapon of defense, the Persians were employing the absence of heat to render the desert habitable. This directs us to the Persian wind catchers, a system of cooling that functioned devoid of a solitary moving component or a watt of energy. Within the central Iranian desert, particularly within the city of Yazd, the landscape is defined by lofty chimney, like edifices that ascend above the skyline. These are recognized as badgers or wind catchers. Some of these towers have endured for hundreds of years, furnishing a constant flow of cool air to the edifices beneath, devoid of the application of a solitary moving component or a watt of electricity. Within a region where summer temperatures frequently surpass 40 degrees Celsius, these towers were the primary technology that permitted a sophisticated urban civilization to thrive within one of the most severe environments on Earth. The chronicle of the Windcatcher is rooted within the ingenuity of ancient Persian architects who had to resolve the predicament of extreme heat long preceding the era of mechanical cooling. Yazd constitutes one of the oldest continually inhabited cities globally, and its survival depended entirely upon the management of two resources, water and air. The Nabateans mastered the storage of water within Jordan, and the Persians similarly cultivated a system to harvest the wind. By constructing these vertical shafts, they could access the cooler, faster moving air currents that circulate elevated above the ground, pulling them downward into the living spaces of their dwellings. The science underlying the Windcatcher encompasses two principal physical principles, Bernoulli's principle and the stack effect. Bernoulli's principle states that an increase within the velocity of a fluid within this instance air transpires simultaneously with a decrease within static pressure. Whenever a breeze strikes the summit of the tower, it enters one of several vertical apertures. Because the air is moving more rapidly at the tower's summit than at ground level, a high-pressure zone is generated that compels the air downward. Concurrently, upon the opposite side of the tower, a low-pressure zone is generated, which assists to extract warm air from the building. The stack effect functions in tandem with this pressure discrepancy. Throughout the day, as the sun heats the walls of the Windcatcher, the air within the shaft becomes warmer and starts to ascend. The Romans did not possess diamond-tipped implements or powered saws, yet they were capable of excavating, shaping, and burnishing this rock into elaborate sculptures and colossal columns. Contemporary investigations have demonstrated that even employing present-day industrial diamond saws, slicing through a solitary block of porphyry constitutes an incredibly sluggish and costly procedure that deteriorates equipment at a pace seldom observed with marble or granite. The reality that the Romans were accomplishing this with iron chisels constitutes a technical anomaly. Archaeological surveys of the mine directed by investigators like Richard Delbrousse and subsequently by Max Peacock and Valerie Maxfield have emphasized the sheer difficulty of the operation. The principal quarries were situated 600 meters up steep vertical precipices. The Romans had to erect a fortified settlement at the mountain's base to accommodate hundreds of specialized laborers. And they constructed an immense cistern system to capture the scarce precipitation that transpires within the desert. To transport the blocks downward from the cliffs, they erected enormous stone ramps that remain visible today. The workers would slide blocks weighing 20 tons or greater down these inclines, a procedure that demanded absolute precision to prevent the stone from fracturing or deviating into the chasm. The authentic shaping of the stone is where the forfeited technology aspect is most conspicuous. To carve the intricate particulars witnessed upon the sarcophagi of the Roman elite, the smiths had to fabricate iron tools with a specific degree of carbon content and tempering. We still remain unaware of the precise chemical process they employed to render their iron sufficiently rigid to penetrate the porphyry without shattering. It is probable they utilized a combination of heat treatment and chemical baths involving acidic substances, but the recipe was never documented. They also employed emery, a rigid abrasive powder from the island of Naxos, to gradually grind the surface. This was a procedure of years, not days. A singular porphyry column could consume a lifetime of manual labor to polish to its glass-like finish. The worth of these objects within the ancient world was astronomical. Perhaps the most renowned illustration of this imperial extravagance is Nero's bathtub. This immense monolithic basin carved from a solitary block of imperial porphyry currently resides within the Vatican Museum. It is so vast and so flawlessly carved that its value presently is effectively incalculable. It symbolizes not merely a piece of furniture, but the absolute control of a state that could command thousands of men to expend years within a desert to produce a singular object for the emperor's private utilization. Other celebrated monuments that utilized the stone incorporated the Pantheon, the Great Palace of Constantinople, and the Hagia Sophia, which featured colossal porphyry columns that were frequently recycled from even older Roman temples. The Romans essentially mined the stone into a condition of functional extinction. Because the mine was so minute and the demand from the emperor so elevated, the accessible veins of the supreme quality deep purple stone were ultimately exhausted. By the era the Roman administrative framework started to disintegrate during the 5th century, the mine was becoming a ghost town. When the empire relinquished control of Egypt to the Arab conquests during the 7th century, the location of Mons porphyrites was forgotten. The desert reclaimed the roads, and the secret of the Purple Mountain was forfeited to the world for over a millennium. Throughout the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, the sole method to obtain imperial porphyry was to pilfer it from ancient ruins. This practice, recognized as spolia, became a refined art form. Popes and monarchs would command the dismantling of Roman temples merely to acquire a few slabs of the purple stone to embellish their own cathedrals and tombs. This recycling elucidates why you can observe fragments of Roman porphyry within Westminster Abbey in London or within the floors of St. Peter's Basilica. The stone was treated as a finite magical substance that could no longer be produced, rendering it more valuable than the gold that frequently surrounded it. The Renaissance attempts to work the stone were notoriously catastrophic. Legend maintains that even the great Michelangelo discovered his finest steel chisels would shatter when they struck a block of Roman porphyry. It was not until the late 16th century, under the patronage of the Medicis in Florence, that a smith allegedly discovered a method to temper iron utilizing a distilled liquid of herbs and minerals that permitted the carving of the stone again. Even then, they could solely achieve a fraction of the detail that the original Roman masters had produced 15 centuries earlier. Contemporary investigators have ultimately rediscovered the mine led there by Bedouin guides during the early 19th century. We can now slice the stone with diamond saws and relocate it with hydraulic cranes. Yet, we still perceive the Roman accomplishments within the eastern desert to be a staggering feat of logistics. They sustained an industrial metropolis in a location where no life should have been feasible, all to obtain a color. The forfeited technology here is not solely the tempering of the iron, but the incredible coordination required to sustain such a high-stakes operation over 400 years devoid of modern medicine, water transport, or mechanical power. Imperial porphyry stands as a reminder that even the most rigid substances on Earth can be conquered by human will, but solely as long as the comprehension and the state that supports it persist intact. When the Roman guilds perished, the purple stone became a mystery once more, a silent record of a civilization that had attained a zenith of material science that would not be matched until the era of industrial diamonds. While the builders of the Roman Empire were utilizing their industrial might to subdue the most rigid rocks on Earth, a group of Greek engineers was employing their understanding of physics to construct something entirely distinct. They fabricated a device that condensed the entire movement of the solar system into a bronze container no larger than a shoebox. This was the Antikythera mechanism, an object so advanced that it contests our traditional timeline of human progress. For nearly 2,000 years, This device lay concealed within the profound waters of the Aegean Sea until an incidental discovery by sponge divers altered our comprehension of ancient science. During the year 1900, a group of divers seeking shelter from a tempest anchored their vessel adjacent to the minor island of Antikythera. While exploring the seabed at a depth of approximately 45 meters, they discovered the remnants of an immense Roman cargo ship that had sunk during the 1st century before the Common Era. Among the marble statues and bronze artifacts recovered from the location was a corroded, calcified lump of bronze that appeared to be of minimal value. It resided within a museum storage facility for 2 years before it commenced to desiccate and split open. This revealed the unmistakable outlines of gear teeth and intricate internal mechanisms, igniting a century of scientific debate. The internal architecture of the device comprises at minimum 30 interlocking bronze gears, each carved with microscopic precision. These gears were not engineered to indicate the time within the modern sense, but rather to compute the motions of the heavens. By rotating a solitary hand crank upon the side of the wooden case, the user could move the entire system forward or backward in time. This input would activate a sequence of mathematical outputs upon several dials displaying the position of the sun, the phases of the moon, and the movements of the 5 planets known to the ancients. The most sophisticated facet of the mechanical design is the utilization of differential gearing. This is a system that permits 2 distinct speeds to be combined into a solitary output, a concept that modern engineers once believed was not invented until the 16th century. The Greeks employed this to accommodate the moon's complex motion across the sky. Because the moon's orbit is elliptical, it appears to move more rapidly or slowly at different times. Nevertheless, the antique Indian smiths employed iron ore that was naturally abundant in phosphorus and elected not to eliminate it throughout the smelting procedure. This elevated phosphorus concentration, combined with the manner in which the iron was forged, generated a passive film upon the pillar's surface. This protective stratum is composed of a complex mineral designated as misawite. When the iron was initially exposed to the atmosphere and the humidity of the Indian climate, a slender stratum of iron oxide, standard rust, started to develop. However, owing to the phosphorus within the metal, this rust did not continue to penetrate into the pillar's core. Instead, the phosphorus functioned as a catalyst, converting the rust into a dense amorphous stratum of iron hydrogen phosphate. This misawite film is solely approximately 1/20th of a millimeter thick, yet it is incredibly stable and completely airtight. It effectively seals the iron away from the environment, impeding oxygen and moisture from reaching the underlying metal. The fabrication procedure itself was a masterpiece of forge welding. The pillar was not cast within a solitary mold. Instead, it was constructed stratum by stratum. Indian smiths employed a technique where minor lumps of incandescent hot iron were hammered together into a solid mass. You can still observe the hammer impressions upon the pillar's surface where these individual fragments were fused. This method guaranteed that the impurities, predominantly slag, were extruded and that the phosphorus was distributed uniformly throughout the structure. It was a labor-intensive process that demanded hundreds of laborers to synchronize their motions around an immense white, hot mass of metal. The Gupta Empire sustained this degree of specialized labor because their society was founded upon the integration of science and religion. The Asra Shastra, or the antique Indian science of minerals and metals, was a highly developed domain. Practitioners of this science were not solely blacksmiths. They were early chemists who comprehended how different ores and fuel sources impacted the final product. They utilized charcoal-based smelting, which permitted a slower, more regulated chemical exchange between the fuel and the metal. This was the foundation of Indian metallurgy, which was celebrated across the ancient world for producing some of the finest iron and steel in existence. The investigation of the iron pillar attained a turning point with the labor of R. Balasubramaniam, who substantiated that the durability of the pillar was a deliberate consequence of the antique smelting technique. He demonstrated that the ancient Indians had essentially created a self-healing material. If the pillar's surface is scratched or chipped, the exposed iron simply reacts with the air to cultivate a fresh stratum of misolite. This is a degree of environmental adaptation that modern metallurgical engineers are still endeavoring to entirely replicate in sustainable manners. The forfeiture of this specific technology transpired during the 19th century with the advent of the Industrial Revolution in India. As the British colonial administration introduced modern coal-based smelting, the traditional charcoal-based method started to vanish. Coal-based smelting is considerably faster and yields larger quantities of iron, but it introduces different impurities, specifically sulfur, into the metal. Sulfur impedes the formation of the protective misolite stratum. As the specialized comprehension of the antique smelting guilds perished, the capacity to produce rustless iron upon this scale was forfeited to the drive for industrial speed and volume. The transition from charcoal to coal altered the chemistry of Indian iron permanently. The older wrought iron was supplanted by mass-produced cast iron and steel which, while stronger in tension, lacked the unique corrosion resistance of the Gupta-era metal. The traditional smiths were no longer commissioned for massive public monuments, and their technical manuals were frequently oral traditions that were not fully documented. By the mid-19th century, the specific formula for generating the phosphorus-rich passive film was effectively vanished, replaced by contemporary galvanization and chemical coatings that demand constant upkeep. Celebrated edifices and monuments across India employ this iron technology, incorporating the immense iron beams discovered within the Konark Sun Temple and the temple at Puri. These structures utilized iron as a structural reinforcement, permitting considerably larger stone spans than would be feasible otherwise. Within these coastal environments where saline air constitutes a constant threat, the rustless iron was essential. The reality that these beams have endured the salty atmosphere for 800 years is another testament to the consistency of this metallurgical tradition before its eventual decline. In the modern era, we can generate various rust-resistant alloys such as stainless steel by incorporating substantial quantities of chromium and nickel. However, these are costly and energy-intensive to manufacture. The iron pillar symbolizes a different approach, a simple wrought iron that employs its own internal chemistry to protect itself. We can replicate the chemical signature presently, but we grapple to replicate the longevity of this specific material devoid of utilizing modern additives. The pillar persists as a physical record of an era when Indian metallurgy was the most advanced globally, employing the natural properties of the earth to create something that appears to exist outside of time. From the chemical mastery of Indian iron to the monumental engineering of the Andes, we observe the different manners ancient civilizations resolved the predicament of permanence. While the metallurgists in Delhi were manipulating the molecular structure of metal to prevent rust, the Inca were manipulating the very foundations of the earth to withstand the violence of the tectonic plates. Elevated above the city of Cusco in contemporary Peru resides Sacsayhuaman, an immense citadel that features some of the largest and most precisely fitted stone blocks in human history. To the Spanish conquistadors who initially witnessed it during the 16th century, the location was so inexplicable that they believed it must have been constructed by demons rather than men. The revelation of the sheer magnitude of Sacsayhuaman discloses a degree of logistical coordination that was unmatched within the pre-Columbian Americas. The site is defined by 3 parallel zigzag walls, each extending over 400 meters. These walls are composed of limestone blocks, some of which exceed 9 meters in height and weigh as much as 120 tons. Despite their immense size and irregular polygonal shapes, these stones fit together with such precision that a solitary blade of grass cannot be inserted between the joints. This was accomplished devoid of the utilization of mortar, iron implements, or even the wheel, rendering it a masterpiece of mechanical engineering, as well as the largest structure ever attempted within the pre-Columbian Americas. To comprehend the magnitude of this achievement, we must observe the rapid evolution of the Inca people. Originally a minor tribe within the Cusco Valley, the Inca transformed into the largest empire within the Western Hemisphere in just under a century. Before the mid-15th century, their building style was far more modest, consisting principally of field stones held together with mud mortar. However, as they expanded, they cultivated a religious and political obsession with stone. For the Inca, stone was a living sacred material. They believed that by precisely shaping and joining rocks devoid of the utilization of mortar, they were creating a divine harmony between human labor and the natural world. This shift in style coincided with the reign of Pachacuti, the 9th Sapa Inca. Under his guidance, the Inca moved away from simple perca masonry, rough stone and mud, to the imperial style we witness at Sacsayhuaman. This advancement was not solely concerning aesthetics. It was a psychological instrument of the empire. By relocating boulders that weighed as much as 120 tons, the Inca state demonstrated its absolute control over both the environment and its population. They proceeded to advance this technology by experimenting with different varieties of rock from soft limestone to incredibly rigid andesite, formulating specific implements and techniques for each. The mobilization necessary for these mass construction endeavors was sustained by the MIT system, a form of obligatory public service. Each robust male citizen was obligated to contribute labor to state projects for a predetermined number of months annually. This was not perceived as enslavement, but as a reciprocal relationship. The state furnished nourishment, chicha, beer, and protection. And in reciprocation, the populace furnished the physical might to erect the empire's infrastructure. At Sacsayhuaman, it is approximated that 20,000 men labored in constant rotations. Some were specialists, architects, master masons, and rope fabricators, while the majority supplied the raw power required to haul the stones from the quarries. The methodology of this mobilization is discovered within the Inca's mastery of the terrain. To convey a 100-ton block, they constructed immense, gently sloping ramps composed of compacted earth and gravel. They employed thousands of feet of dense fiber ropes woven from the resilient grass of the high Andes and lubricated the ramps with damp clay or spherical river stones to function as primitive ball bearings. It was a triumph of coordination. Foremen utilized rhythmic chanting and whistles to guarantee that hundreds of men hauled at the precise same instant, generating the abrupt bursts of kinetic energy necessary to overcome the static friction of a limestone monolith. The zigzag walls of the location were erected for several rationales. Strategically, the zigzag configuration was a defensive masterpiece. It permitted defenders to shower projectiles upon the flanks of any assailing force. Politically, it functioned as a ceremonial center for the festival of Inti Raymi, devoted to the sun deity. Yet upon a more profound level, it was constructed to demonstrate that the Inca were the masters of the mountains. They were not merely erecting a fortress. They were literally reshaping the mountain's flank to correspond with their imperial vision. The science of Inca masonry is centered upon the concept of polygonal masonry and three-dimensional interlocking. Unlike the rectangular bricks employed within Western architecture, the Inca molded their stones into complex multi-faceted forms. Each stone was custom fitted to the ones encircling it, generating a jigsaw-like construction. This design constituted a highly advanced seismic technology. The Andes constitute one of the most seismically active regions on Earth. Whenever an earthquake strikes, the stones of an Inca wall are engineered to dance. They shift and vibrate in situ, absorbing the tremor's energy and subsequently settle back into their original positions once the shaking ceases. While the Spanish colonial edifices within Cusco have collapsed repeatedly due to earthquakes, the walls of Sacsayhuaman have remained unmoved for 6 centuries. The method of how these stones were shaped persisted as a mystery for centuries, leading to theories regarding stone softening techniques. Nevertheless, the labor of investigator Jean-Pierre Pratzen during the 1980s supplied a more grounded explanation. Through experimental archaeology, Pratzen demonstrated that the limestone could be shaped employing hammerstones, harder river rocks like olivine basalt. By repeatedly pounding the limestone, a mason could peel away the surface until the desired form was attained. Pratzen illustrated that a proficient laborer could generate a perfectly flat surface or a complex curve employing solely these elementary implements. However, Pratzen's experiments also emphasized the limitations of our comprehension. While we understand the stones were shaped this manner, we are still debating how they were custom, fitted with such precision at such a massive magnitude. To fit a 100-ton block against its neighbor, the stone would have had to be relocated, inspected, carved, and relocated again multiple times. The logistics of elevating and lowering these blocks to accomplish a zero-gap fit constitutes a feat of coordination that modern engineers still find challenging to conceptualize, devoid of the utilization of hydraulic cranes. The forfeiture of this incredible technology commenced with the Spanish conquest during the 1530s when Francisco Pizarro and his men captured Cusco. They were astonished by the architecture, but they perceived the location as a military threat. The specialized class of Inca architects and master masons who held the oral traditions of stone listening were among the initial to be targeted or executed throughout the collapse of the imperial administration. Without the Mita system to organize the labor and the master mages of stone to guide the construction, the comprehension of how to maintain and erect these walls perished within a singular generation. The Spanish ultimately utilized Sacsayhuaman as a quarry for their own construction projects within Cusco. They dismantled the upper, minor tiers of the walls to erect cathedrals, government edifices, and private mansions. However, when they reached the lower strata of the zigzag walls, they were compelled to halt. The blocks were simply excessively large for the Spanish to relocate or annihilate utilizing their 16th century technology. They abandoned the massive limestone monoliths in position, not out of respect for the Inca accomplishment, but because they lacked the mechanical means to displace them. The ruins we observe presently are essentially the immovable remnants of a much larger complex. In the modern era, we can replicate the appearance of Inca masonry employing diamond-tipped saws and heavy-duty cranes, but we still grapple to replicate the efficiency and environmental integration of the original system. Modern masonry depends upon standardization and speed, whereas the Inca employed the unique geometry of every individual stone. Recent investigations employing LiDAR and three-dimensional modeling have demonstrated that the entire hill of Sacsayhuaman was reshaped by the Inca with concealed drainage systems and subterranean chambers that are solely now being charted. We comprehend the mathematics underlying the polygonal joints, but the logistics of the trial An error-fitting procedure at a 100-ton magnitude persists as one of the greatest enigmas of antique engineering. The massive stones of Sacsayhuaman were constructed to endure the physical violence of the earth. Yet within the Roman world, a different variety of durability was sought to symbolize the eternal nature of the state. This substance was imperial porphyry. While the Inca were fitting mountain-sized blocks together with gravitational precision, the Romans were concentrated upon a volcanic rock so rigid it defied almost every implement of the ancient world. This stone exceeded a building material. It was a physical manifestation of the emperor's authority. Its mastery symbolized a zenith of Roman industrial organization that for a period rendered the impossible a reality of the imperial court. The narrative of this stone commences during the middle of the 1st century AD, throughout the reign of Emperor Claudius. It was then that a Roman official named Caius Cominius Liugus discovered the sole source of this deep purple rock within the known world. It was not discovered within a lush valley or adjacent to a major metropolis, but within the midst of the eastern desert of Egypt at a location presently designated Mons Porphyrites, or the Porphyry Mountain. The location was so remote and the environment so hostile that the very existence of a mining colony there persists as a logistical puzzle. The quarry was nearly 100 miles from the nearest water source, the Nile River, and concealed within a desolate, jagged mountain range where temperatures could fluctuate between blistering heat and freezing mountain air. We must differentiate imperial porphyry from normal porphyry. While numerous volcanic rocks possess a porphyritic texture, signifying they have larger crystals embedded within a finer grain, solely the stone from this one Egyptian mountain possessed a deep, vibrant purple hue. This color was induced by a specific mineral designated as piemontite. Within Rome, the color purple surpassed a fashion selection. It was a state monopoly. The Tyrian purple dye employed for robes was worth more than its weight in gold, and by extension, a solid stone of the identical hue became the exclusive property of the emperor. To even possess a fragment of this stone devoid of imperial authorization constituted a crime against the state. The science underlying the stone clarifies why it constituted such a nightmare for antique craftsmen. Upon the Mohs scale of hardness, imperial porphyry ranks between 7 and 8, rendering it as rigid as modern tempered steel. This generates a fundamental mystery. Throughout the Carolingian epoch, the Franks constituted the superpower of Europe, possessing the most systematized workshops and an expanding comprehension of industrial-scale fabrication. While the swords were Frankish in origin, they became most celebrated within the grasp of the Vikings. The Norsemen were the ultimate consumers of high-end military technology, and through both commerce and raids, they acquired these superior blades. During the 9th century, the Rhineland functioned as a hub of trade and craftsmanship, where master smiths operated under rigorous regulations, and the Ulfbert name likely functioned as an early trademark of a specific high-output workshop. The enigma of the Ulfbert resides within the composition of the metal itself. In contrast to the pattern-welded blades of the era, the authentic Ulfbert swords were fabricated from high-carbon crucible steel. This substance was characterized by a consistent purity and a carbon content nearly thrice as elevated as any other European blade of the period. Crucible steel necessitates the iron to be heated to approximately 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. At this temperature, the iron becomes entirely liquid, permitting the slag to ascend to the surface and be removed. This procedure yields a steel that is virtually devoid of the internal frailties that provoke standard swords to shatter against shields. For a millennium, historians believed that European technology was incapable of attaining these temperatures until the Industrial Revolution of the 1800s. The metallurgical analysis performed by Dr. Alan Williams has been central to comprehending this anomaly. By examining the microscopic architecture of Ulfbert specimens, Williams discovered that the steel was remarkably homogeneous. This degree of purity signified the sword could be rendered thinner, lighter, and considerably more pliable than a pattern-welded blade. For a Viking warrior, this constituted a matter of life and death. A standard sword might fail after striking a heavy wooden shield, but an Ulfbert could flex and revert to its original form, preserving a razor-keen edge throughout an entire campaign. This permitted a faster, more nimble style of combat that was simply not feasible with heavier, more cumbersome iron armaments. Due to their immense cost and superior performance, these swords were employed by the highest-ranking warriors and members of the elite. They were status symbols that operated much like a luxury brand within the modern sense. However, the prestige of the name precipitated an early form of industrial espionage and counterfeiting. Numerous of the surviving Ulfbert swords are actually inferior quality forgeries fabricated from standard bloomery iron with the name misspelled or other variations. The authentic crucible steel blades, nevertheless, persisted in a class of their own, likely produced within the Frankish Rhineland before being traded into Scandinavia. The methodology behind the production of these swords was investigated in a notable PBS Nova documentary. Contemporary blacksmiths endeavored to recreate an Ulfbert employing solely the implements and materials accessible during the 9th century. They discovered that even with expert knowledge, the procedure of constructing a furnace capable of attaining and sustaining 3,000 degrees constituted a significant challenge. The experiment emphasized that the ancient smiths must have possessed a specialized comprehension of airflow and fuel varieties, specifically the utilization of charcoal and bone to reach iron's melting point. Bone, intriguingly, could have furnished the necessary carbon and phosphorus to assist in purifying the steel, suggesting that the smiths may have even employed ritualistic elements like the bones of ancestors or animals to fortify the metal. A major theory regarding the origin of this steel involves the commerce routes established by the Vikings. While the swords were likely forged within Europe, the raw crucible steel may have originated within Central Asia. During the zenith of the Viking Age, the Volga trade route connected Scandinavia to the Islamic world, where the fabrication of Wootz steel was already established. It is theorized that the Vikings exchanged furs, wax, and captives for minor ingots of high-carbon steel from locales like contemporary Turkmenistan or Afghanistan. These ingots were then transported back to Europe and forged into the Ulfbert blades by Frankish master smiths. The forfeiture of this technology coincided with the severing of these eastern trade routes during the 11th century. As political shifts and conflicts disrupted the flow of goods along the Volga and the Caspian Sea, the provision of high-carbon crucible steel from Central Asia depleted. Without the raw material, European smiths were incapable of producing the Ulfbert quality blades. They possessed the blacksmithing skills to shape the metal, but they lacked the geological or chemical comprehension to manufacture the steel itself from local European ores. Consequently, metallurgy within Northern Europe reverted to the inferior pattern welding technique for nearly 800 years. This abrupt decline in quality is visible within the archaeological record. The swords produced following the 11th century started to display elevated levels of slag and a return to the sandwiching of different iron grades to achieve strength. The secret of the crucible steel vanished because it was a technology dependent upon a specific global supply chain rather than a localized invention. The Ulfbert was a globalized product, and once the connection between the source and the forge was fractured, the technology perished with it. It would not be until the advancement of the Bessemer process during the 19th century that Europe would again consistently produce steel of this purity. Contemporary smiths have successfully fabricated replicas of the Ulfbert that matched the strength and purity of the originals, but they almost invariably rely upon modern temperature-controlled furnaces, recreating the blade from inception utilizing solely raw ore and a charcoal fire persists as a feat that demands a degree of intuition regarding the behavior of the molten metal that we struggle to replicate. We comprehend the chemistry of why the swords were superior, but we are still assembling the precise configuration of the ancient forges that permitted these outcomes to be attained on a consistent foundation. The transition from the forged steel of the Vikings to the massive iron casting of ancient India discloses another instance where metallurgy attained a zenith that left modern observers baffled. While the Vikings were mastering the portable power of the sword, engineers within Delhi were creating a massive monument that has endured for over 1,600 years, devoid of a solitary speck of rust. Standing 23 feet elevated within the Qubh complex of Delhi, the iron pillar constitutes a 6-ton testament to the advanced chemical comprehension of the Gupta Empire. To the tourists who visit the location presently, it resembles a simple dark metallic column. Yet to material scientists, it constitutes a metallurgical anomaly that has defied the natural procedure of corrosion for more than a millennium. The pillar was commissioned by Chandragupta II, one of the most potent emperors of the Gupta dynasty during the 4th century AD. This was the golden age of India, a period defined by massive advancements in mathematics, astronomy, and chemistry. Originally intended as a daba or standard for the deity Vishnu, the pillar was likely positioned at a temple complex in Udayagiri before being relocated to its current location within Delhi centuries later. It was constructed as a victory monument intended to stand as a permanent record of the emperor's triumphs. During that era, iron constituted a difficult material to manipulate upon such a vast magnitude, and the creation of a 6-ton solid iron column constituted a feat of engineering that would not be matched within Europe for another 1,000 years. The primary mystery surrounding the pillar is why it has not rusted away. Within the humid monsoon climate of Delhi, an iron object of this magnitude should have disintegrated into a mound of crimson dust centuries ago. For an extensive duration, investigators speculated that the iron might be of an extraterrestrial origin or possessed some magical purity. It was not until the late 20th century that scientific analysis supplied a more grounded explanation. The rustlessness of the pillar is not due to the purity of the iron, but rather a specific chemical reaction transpiring upon its surface. Detailed investigations conducted by R. Balasubramaniam from the Indian Institute of Technology have deciphered the science of this protective stratum. He discovered that the pillar is fabricated from a specific variety of raw iron with an unusually elevated phosphorus content. Within modern steelmaking, phosphorus is usually eliminated because it renders the metal brittle and difficult to weld. The engineers accomplished this by employing a pin and slot mechanism where one gear sits marginally off-center upon another, generating a variable speed that emulates the lunar cycle. Upon the rear of the device, 2 extensive spiral dials tracked longer cycles, incorporating the Saros cycle utilized to predict solar and lunar eclipses. The mechanism was so accurate that it could inform the user not solely when an eclipse would transpire, but the precise time of day and even the hue of the moon throughout the event. It also featured a minor dial to monitor the 4-year cycle of the Panhellenic Games, guaranteeing that the Olympic festivals were accurately scheduled. This integration of social, religious, and astronomical data implies the device was a comprehensive cultural instrument employed by the Greek elite. The device is believed to have been constructed around the 2nd century before the Common Era. a period when Greek mathematics and mechanics attained a specific zenith. While we remain unaware of the name of the exact fabricator, scholars frequently indicate the island of Rhodes as its probable origin. Rhodes was a major center for astronomical investigation and was the residence of Hipparchus, one of the greatest astronomers of antiquity. Some investigators also believe the device symbolizes a tradition of mechanical construction initiated by Archimedes of Syracuse, who was recognized to have fabricated spheres that demonstrated the motions of the planets. The technical zenith of the 2nd century before the Common Era was a time of intense intellectual curiosity within the Mediterranean. Scientists were commencing to apply geometry to the physical world, creating instruments that could measure the Earth's circumference or the distance to the Moon. The Antikythera mechanism was the pinnacle of this movement, a physical proof that the universe adhered to mathematical laws. It was not merely a toy for the wealthy. It was a functioning analog computer that permitted a traveler to convey the secrets of the solar system in their hand. For decades, the authentic complexity of the Antikythera mechanism remained concealed beneath strata of corrosion and marine accretion. During the 1950s, historian Derek J. DeSala-Price commenced the first serious scientific investigation utilizing X-ray photography. He was the initial individual to recognize that the device was a complex astronomical computer rather than a simple astrolabe. His labor was revolutionary, but the technology of the era could not perceive through the dense bronze to chart the internal gear arrangement completely. Price's research furnished the first skeletal model of the system, but many of the internal planetary gears persisted as a mystery. During the early 21st century, the Antikythera mechanism research project directed by Tony Freeth and Mike Edmonds employed advanced microfocus X-ray tomography. This permitted them to gaze inside the fragments in 3 dimensions, revealing thousands of minute Greek characters inscribed upon the interior surfaces. These inscriptions functioned as a user manual clarifying how the different dials operated and what the various astronomical symbols signified. This breakthrough affirmed that the device featured cycles for all 5 planets Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. The inscriptions discovered upon the device were not solely labels, but a complex set of instructions. They described the heliacal risings and settings of stars, which constitute the moments when a star initially becomes visible within the morning light or disappears in the evening. This data was essential for farmers and mariners who employed the stars to monitor the seasons and navigate the seas. The text also mentions the hue of eclipses, which was believed to possess astrological significance within the ancient world. This indicates that the device was a profoundly integrated portion of how the Greeks comprehended their position within the cosmos. The shipwreck at Antikythera was likely a vessel conveying plundered Greek treasures back to Rome to satisfy the escalating demand for Greek culture among the Roman elite. The presence of so many high-value items suggests that the ship was portion of a major operation to transport Greek heritage to the Roman capital. The cargo incorporated fine pottery, glassware, and even large quantities of luxury food items, indicating that the Roman appetite for Greek refinement was propelling a massive maritime industry. When the ship foundered within the profound waters of the Aegean, it took with it the sole surviving specimen of this degree of mechanical engineering. It is a sobering realization that if the divers had not discovered this specific wreck, we might never have known that the Greeks were capable of fabricating gears this minute or this complex. The historical record for the subsequent 1,500 years displays a complete absence of any mechanical devices that approach matching the Antikythera mechanism. While the Middle Ages produced sophisticated clocks, They did not employ the differential gearing or the planetary mathematics discovered within this antique bronze container. The secret of the Greek computer was literally interred at the ocean's floor. The disappearance of this technology is frequently attributed to the shifting priorities of the Mediterranean world. As the Roman Republic transitioned into the empire, the elevated, level theoretical mathematics of the Greeks were frequently supplanted by the more pragmatic engineering of the Romans. The specialized workshops that could produce bronze gears with the necessary precision to track an elliptical orbit likely perished as the demand shifted away from astronomical models. By the era the Western Roman Empire collapsed, the comprehension required to even understand how such a machine functioned was almost entirely forfeited. Modern watchmakers and scientists have constructed several operational replicas of the mechanism, but the procedure has emphasized the sheer difficulty of the original construction. To attain the necessary degree of precision, contemporary builders typically utilize computer-controlled milling machines and high tensile alloys. The Greeks, however, were laboring with hand implements and cast bronze. They had to manually cut the triangular teeth of each gear, guaranteeing that they were perfectly uniform, so the system would not jam. This demanded a degree of manual dexterity and mathematical intuition that is extremely uncommon, even among modern master craftsmen. Tony Freeth's team employed a specialized 8-ton X-ray machine to scan the fragments, which permitted them to perceive through the bronze in slices merely a few microns thick. They discovered that the primary drive wheel possessed a complex set of 4 gears attached to its rear, which they had previously overlooked. These gears were accountable for the planetary cycles. This discovery was the final fragment of the puzzle that permitted investigators to construct a complete model of the device that accounts for every dial. An inscription discovered upon the original fragments. The investigation of the Antikythera mechanism has compelled us to reevaluate the technological status of the ancient world. It demonstrates that the Greeks had resolved the predicament of transforming mathematical theory into physical hardware, long preceding the scientific revolution. The device was a bridge between the abstract geometry of the stars and the pragmatic necessities of navigation and timekeeping. It symbolizes a pinnacle of human ingenuity that was attained, mastered, and then abandoned as the civilizations of antiquity transitioned into the medieval era. The shipwreck itself is still being explored by archaeologists, presently employing contemporary diving equipment and robotic submersibles. Each year, novel artifacts are conveyed to the surface, each one appending a fresh stratum of detail to our comprehension of the ship's final journey. While no other mechanism has been discovered, the search persists for fragments of the wooden case or other bronze components that might have been dispersed across the seabed. The location remains one of the most significant underwater archaeological locales globally. When we observe the Antikythera mechanism alongside the other technologies we have investigated, a pattern of brilliance and forfeiture becomes evident. From the self-repairing concrete of Rome to the high-carbon steel of the Vikings, human history is abundant with these technical zeniths. These breakthroughs were not merely fortunate accidents. They were the consequence of specialized knowledge and organized effort. By comprehending how the Greeks constructed a computer without electricity, or how the Persians cooled their dwellings without power, we can discover novel methods to resolve the challenges of our own era. These antique technologies remind us that innovation is not perpetually concerning the newest material or the swiftest processor. Occasionally, the most sophisticated solution is the one that employs the fundamental laws of nature in the most elegant manner. What do you think? Let me know within the comments. Subscribe to Forbidden Fathoms for additional intriguing ancient mysteries, and be certain to examine our other videos for more ancient mysteries. Until next time, remain inquisitive and remain secure.